Joe Gleason, thank you for being on the Cullahcast. Appreciate it. How you doing?
Doing well. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. It's been I think this is the first time actually meeting you. We've chatted briefly on Twitter, but I've first met you when we both escaped to Middle Earth. Was it
Yes.
maybe a month ago or something like that? Maybe at this point.
It feels like a year ago,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
yeah, it was only like a month
I
ago.
can't keep track of all this. I don't know. The days blend together, but yeah,
Yeah.
the affinity for Lord of the Rings. But I've always loved Tolkien and everything. My mom was a huge fan growing up, and The Hobbit was like we read that constantly, and I had it on tape. Well, it was on CD. I had The Hobbit on CD and listened to it every night. Going to bed, and it was amazing. But we both, and I don't know what your connection is, but how you got into that. But I heard of Becca Tarnas through. Well, I went down a whole recent kind of discovery of different concepts like archetypal psychology, and alchemical psychology, and all these different aspects of the psyche, and from first reading Dr. Robert Moore's book about the mature masculine archetypes, the four mature masculine archetypes. And that was just me I had just heard of archetypes and story. I'm like, I need to look more into that for better storytelling. But then it turned out to be an incredibly fruitful path down. Then I found James Hillman, then I found Richard Tarnas, which then led me to Beckett, which then led me to you in a experience with Tolkien, which is great. That's a great origin right there.
That it's like a super cool origin because I was like, wait a second, like who is this person? At first I was like, why do I follow this person? Because I forgot like what the connection was. And I love that it was like Hillman Tarnas, Becca Tarnas,
Right.
escape to Middle Earth, and like here we are. It's like really roundabout but really cool. Yeah, I'm a huge Tolkien nerd. That started way before astrology started for me. Um, let's see. I first read the trilogy, or I first read the Lord of the Rings thing when I was a teenager. I don't remember how old I was when I first read it, but I read The Hobbit when I was younger a couple of times. And I actually did you know Becca Tarnas has a class on, like, it's like a guided read through of Lord of the
I,
Rings?
I didn't know she had a class, but I had seen her lectures on a couple of her lectures on YouTube about Young and Tolkien, and about Tolkien, and some of her some of her lectures and the literature that she's written about it. So I'm not surprised.
Yeah, she does like a guided read through, and like I had heard about it, and then last year I finally participated, and it was like completely magical. Like it just made like the winter such a meaningful span of time. Anyway, Becca's totally brilliant, and so it's like I'm re-engaging with Lord of the Rings as an adult for the first time in a really long time, because the last Tolkien I had read was the Silmarillion when I was
Mm,
like 18. Um, that's a tough read, but
yeah, I never
it's so
got
good.
through
Have you
it.
read the Silmarillion?
I never got through it. I'm not gonna lie, but then again,
I mean, I don't blame you.
when I read the Lord of the Rings, I did skip some of the long-winded stories and kind of went right to the action the first time. I got to reread it again, but
You
that's just
do.
the truth. I when I was a kid, I was like, these are cool, but like, what happens with Frodo? Like, I want to know what's going on with Frodo. I don't want to know about 5 generations back. What's going on?
Yeah.
I don't know. That's where I was very little, and I didn't really have the patience to do it. I was just, but So that, I mean, that's amazing, first of all. And I was honestly like in tears towards the end of the last Lord of the Rings when we were all on Twitter, just like communicating and experiencing it together, and just getting everyone's insight and everyone's perspective on certain things. And, you know, I don't have too much deep like lore knowledge, but I was able to like explore it during that, because I was able to like, share. I looked something up and I'd just be like, oh, that's cool. And I'd share it. And, or of course, Becca would have something incredibly insightful to say that no one would ever know. That's just so profound.
That's
and
Becca.
And I was like, damn, okay. But yeah, like, but that was I ended up really, actually, I started writing a song about the two trees of Valinor from all being inspired by that. And it was really, I really like it right now. So we'll see if that comes on in the next album. But yeah, so Tolkien is ubiquitous, you know, across all storyteller, lovers of story and everything. But I want to kind of know more about your astrology your expertise in astrology and how that all got started. Like, is that something that you've been interested for a long time, or is it a recent thing? And
Yeah, it's been pretty long standing. Like, I remember being like a tween and they had those like books you took to sleepovers when you were like 11, 12, like with the little quizzes in the back, like personality quizzes, and they had like sun sign stuff. And I always thought it was like really cool, but like very forbidden, because I grew up in a really, really Christian household in
Sure.
Oklahoma, where like, you know, you're not supposed to think about those things. It's all evil and stuff like that. So I was like, great, got it. I was like that annoying A+ student that was like, what are the rules? Excellent. I will follow them exactly. So I did that through my teens. And then I kind of had like a spiritual falling out where I just started asking the hard questions about my like religion of origin in my family, and like realizing that there weren't good enough answers for me, and like accepting how that kind of makes your world fall apart if that's what it's based on, which it really was for me. And that's when I was like 19 or 20. So then I was like, great, I'm going to explore everything now. So I started exploring all kinds of stuff. Like, I remember watching the spirit science videos on YouTube.
Yeah, dude, that was the beginning for me too. I'm not gonna lie.
Dude, yeah,
That
I
and
remember my
Zeitgeist.
husband and I watched like all the spirit science videos, and we were like, dude,
It started to
what are
get a little
thoughts?
crazy at
like,
the end of it. I was like, I don't know about that. But the
yeah.
first chunk of all that they were doing, I was super into it, and I watched them back again. Yeah, but that's awesome. That's cool. So then what?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that just kind of opened everything up, and then like where it was just really liberating, and it was really freeing. And then I was like, wow, you know, I'm free to explore anything I want to. So I started getting into, I was really interested in like lucid dreaming and like alternative, like nature-based religions and spiritualities like Wicca and stuff. And I was like not scared anymore. So I was like Googling away, like, what
Right.
is witchcraft? What is Wicca? And it's like, oh, it's kind of like the law of attraction, but just with like some more mythology in it. When I was like, great, that sounds awesome. So palmistry kind of hooked me. I thought that was really interesting. Still do. I just haven't delved
Is
like
that
I have with,
dealing with
huh?
reading palms? Is that what you're saying? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So like, yeah, palm reading pretty much. Chiromancy, if you want to sound
Chiromancy.
really cool, which why wouldn't you? But yeah, palmistry was cool. And there were some astrological associations with palmistry,
Yeah.
and astrology just continued to be the most interesting to me. And I kind of kept going back to it in waves. Like, I'd get super into like crystals and like charging them and like what the different kinds meant. And then I get into like meditation and lucid dreaming, and then astrology again. And like astrology just kept being the most interesting to me. So I eventually decided that, quite honestly, I was like, okay, look, I need to know once and for all if this is a real thing,
Right.
or if I am being completely fooled and I just want it to be a real thing. So I was like, I'm going to find the oldest mention of astrology that I can, because I have a lot of intellectual people in my life who are going to ask the questions like, well, how do you know that Venus is the planet of love? Like, why would you know that? Where does it say that? Like, did someone just make that up? So I was like, I'm going to find out. And then I found out there's like, there actually are primary source texts. There are places that you can read from 2000 years ago that say why the planets mean the things that they mean and why. And but in finding that out, it wasn't just as simple as being like, oh, here's Thaddeus Valens from, centuries ago saying this. It was realizing that there was like a whole sector of people in the world, the astrological community, who were not only like professionals in the field, who were educated with under this stuff. Like, it wasn't just some random full moon blog I found. It was like educated professionals who were part of astrological organizations. They had written books. They spoke at astrological conferences. Like, it was a whole world that I didn't know existed. So I found out it existed partially through finding out about something called Project Hindsight, which was a translation initiative that started in the 1990s, where they basically found a bunch of source texts from like Hellenistic Egypt, astrology texts that hadn't been translated from the Arabic or from Greek into English by people who knew the subject matter. And some of them hadn't been translated at all. So that brought to light a bunch of really old, like original OG astrology techniques, not just like, Linda Goodman's love signs, which is great. No shade to Linda Goodman. She's incredible. I don't even know how she's been writing so many books, but yeah. So I essentially found out, I like went straight into the deep end, and I was like, there's not only source text, there's just like this whole community, this whole movement, this whole renaissance happening. And I was like, well, I'm going to go to school for this and become educated so I can be a good representative of the community. Because like I noticed really early on, there are a lot of people who are into astrology who don't really know a whole lot about how to answer those tough questions about it. Like, why does this mean this? Like, where did this information come from? And I was really concerned with being able to answer those questions because I thought it was important. Because you can feel like something's true and it can make sense, but if you can't like have anything at all to back it up, you're just going to make the whole thing look kind of stupid. So I was like, I don't want to look stupid. And I also want to know where this comes from. So then I started going to an astrology school and I started taking other classes, and that was in 2014. So here I am today after years of doing that and doing consultations for people and writing and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that sounds about right. Because I grew up I guess my parents weren't they weren't super conservative and fundamentalist, maybe is a better word. They weren't super fundamentalist, but we were like, their parents were. So they grew up in pretty strict Catholic families, like Irish Catholic. And so, they went to private schools and, got the fear of God beat into them literally, and the deep rooted guilt and shame of the original sin and all these crazy concepts that when you're in it, you don't know that it's there because it's like a fish seeing the water right around you. You don't know it's there. But then going in high school and starting to read like Ralph Waldo Emerson or starting to read some more things, starting to read Aldous Huxley, and seeing things like Spirit Science or the Zeitgeist trilogy. If you ever saw the Zeitgeist, like those, it's you're able to see all these different perspectives. And it did feel for me as well, like, okay, what else is out there? And astrology is something that I've always heard about. Everyone hears about it. Everyone knows about it, and particularly when you study history, like everyone's always talking about how throughout time, people have studied the cosmos. People have looked up to the stars. Like I went and did my father was an amateur astronomer. So we would go to different observer weekends, like where a bunch of astronomy nerds would come together with their homemade telescopes, and they'd look out and they'd tell me like, this is M83, the Crab Nebula, and like this is a pulsar thing, or this is whatever. And they would tell me all about these things that are millions and millions of years of distance away from us, and then just getting some context as to like how long and how far removed we are from them, and the stories that are up there, like all these stories, like I would always think about like how much time, like, and how much like energy and inspiration it would take to map out the whole cosmos with these stories. And like a lot of things, I feel like I don't know, everyone's grown up with the idea of that myth is also almost a pejorative, like oh, that's just a myth, that thing. Whereas now I'm, the more I'm reading and listening to lectures of James Hillman, and just psychologists now, especially it's all, a lot of it seems to be rooted in Jungian thought and stuff. But I don't know, I've always had that inclination inside of me, and that like understanding. It's like, oh, well, there's this deep reverence, and there's these stories, but like, well, what's the purpose then? What's the meaning? Like, no one really knew. It's just like, oh, they just had crazy gods. It's like, well, they believed in some crazy things. They just believed in crazy things, like people believe in crazy things now. But it's like it's so missing the mark of the potency of it, like, and why they did it. Like, what is the social, the psychological, and and the human drive to do all this shit, and so astrology is, I'm starting to now open myself up much more to it through the lens of archetype and through the lens of myth, because before I didn't have that. Before it was still just horoscope, daily horoscope, and when this planet goes here, this happens. Like, it's a 1-to-1, like direct causation, and people, and there are a lot of grifters and a lot of it's a lot of woo woo and stuff, like, but then I moved into this neighborhood here in Milwaukee called River West, and there's a bunch of Wiccans and witches and astrologers, and some of them don't know what they're talking about, like you said. But like, I was with my friend Marina, and we were getting coffee at a shop, and I heard two people behind me just totally deep diving, dissecting into certain constellations and their movements, and I could hear them talking about all the myth involved, and just like passionately describing these myths and like trying to understand how they can use those stories to apply directly to patterns that might be similar now, that could be that we could find these patterns and be that or these stories can be applied to the up to the current day. So it's something that's more new to me as well. I hadn't had the spark at an earlier age to like really go after and study it like you have. But that's what I'm interested in, is like where it's going to take me now, and what I can learn from it, because I started thinking about it more seriously when I was like thinking about how I wanted to make a space opera, and about how I wanted to, and this is something we briefly talked about doing it on my birthday, as I release my music every year on my birthday, which is just in a few days. And I don't know my birth time yet. I did submit the form to try to get my birth records, but they haven't. That was like on Monday, or no, it was on Friday. It was last Friday. So I haven't heard back yet. So they said, I don't know. It's everyone's kind of bogged down in this time.
Totally. I get that.
But I wanted to I was thinking about using astrology as a form, or as like the dialogue, or like to be able to use the stories in astrology to just tell it. Just like, I don't have to come up with the story. I can just tell the story that already exists in the universe, and just, translate it in my own little way. So that's what really got me thinking about the practical, use of astrology, or like mapping that out. And so it started to open things up in terms of moving things from the realm of like woo-woo type thing to the realm of story and myth, and there's so much more than that too, with it, because it's obviously the cosmos. It's dealing with physical reality too, And I don't know. So it's a thing that touches everything, I feel like, because it's so old and so part of ourselves in our history.
Yeah, I agree on that for sure. It's like an intersection of so many things. It's an intersection of like story and mythology and like all this archetypal stuff. But like when you look back at these source texts and you look at where this stuff comes from, the stuff that I like use day to day with my clients or whatever, or in my writing, it's connected to the physical as well, and surely they really did think there was some causal mechanism, like
Yeah.
spiritual rays that the planets like shot at each other and came down to Earth, and like we there's no known causal mechanism, sure, but there is a lot of connection to what was visible to them, which I feel like there's a big disconnect unless you literally stargaze all the time and you like actually go outside and look. There's a big disconnect. People are staring at screens all the time to see where the planets are and like what that means. But, there's a reason that like Mars means what it means. And you go outside and it looks like a big fucking red star. Like it looks like an angry star. And
Yeah.
like its movement is very erratic. And like literally its orbit and its speed like changes. It's not as regular. And when you look at like its epicycles or its retrograde cycles, they're much more irregularly timed, whereas Venus's epicycles make a perfect 5-pointed star when you overlay them with like the apparent path of the sun around the Earth. So even in their orbits and what they're physically doing, you see their significations, you see their archetypal quality. And some of the oldest like texts that we can call astrology texts are omen, like big lists of omens, like omen watching text from like the Babylonian age, where it's literally just like there was a haze around the moon and so died or something, or something happened. It's very like empirical. It's very much this was seen, this happened, this was seen, this was this happened. And there's a big empirical piece too with astrology. There's a big symbolic piece and there's a big empirical piece. I think that's something people don't often notice. So what you get with astrology is like, it's not quite the same as like tarot or mediumship or like intuitive stuff where you're just, for lack of a better term, it's a lot more woo. It's a lot more like you got to kind of just feel out that this image means this on this card, or like that this person said they sensed this. But with astrology, it's very symbolic. There is definitely that quality. You feel the story and how alive the story is and how important and meaningful that is. But it's formulaic as well. Like it has a very strong internal logic. Anything does not mean anything. So it's this interesting intersection of like this empirical data that they recorded, this symbolic component, this mythological story component really converging. And I think that's why it hooks people sometimes, is like, how can it be this complex but this woo at the same time, but like works so well? And it could such a convergence of all these different things.
Yeah. And the word, even the woo woo stuff is just, I say it, like from my understanding, it's a dismissive nature of saying, "Whoa, that's woo." That's, that's just stuff that's totally unfounded. Maybe like snake oil, stuff like that. People lump it into that. And I come from a scientific upbringing, like went to study engineering and stuff, and so that's part of why I wasn't even in, like, there are different dogmas in scientific realm, and like there are stigmas that people have for certain, just even just the concept of faith, like people will just be like, that's ridiculous. Like, what? You believe, like, if you believe something, it's faith. It's the same thing, whatever. But so that's, you mentioned something, and this is one of my questions, because I hear this all the time from people. One of the most common things people are talking about is Mercury in retrograde. And I think I understand a little bit about what retrograde is, kind of, because I mean, I understand what those two words and that word mean, but can you explain when people say Mercury's in retrograde, and is that an excuse for their behaviors?
First of all, You can make anything an excuse for your
Yeah, yeah.
behavior, and you probably shouldn't. So, so no, it's not an excuse. However, okay, so I'll explain the technical boring part first.
Okay.
So retrograde is an apparent phenomenon, which means it's how it appears to us on Earth,
Hmm.
um, from a geocentric perspective. Everyone knows that the planets, including Earth, are orbiting the sun. But from Earth's perspective, it looks like they're, you can see the apparent path of the sun and planets
Yeah.
around the Earth. And that's why it's apparent how it appears. So, anyway, it appears that the planets, including Mercury in this case, slow down, stop, and go the opposite direction that they were in their orbit for a period of time, for about 3 weeks, and then go forward again. This is because Mercury is closer to the sun than the Earth. So Mercury kind of laps the
Mm.
Earth. And so that makes sense. You can visualize that happening in a
Yeah.
three-dimensional setting. But here on Earth, from where you are locally, like if you were to literally go outside and look at Mercury as the morning star every morning for like a month straight, you would see it start to be, move a little bit less and less, and then eventually start moving, closer to sunrise versus getting brighter and moving away from sunrise each morning.
Hmm.
And that's kind of what that means. Like it's appearing to go backwards in its orbit before it goes forwards again. It's just an apparent phenomenon.
Ah.
So, on a symbolic level, when a planet goes retrograde, it is a disruption of its normal direction, speed, and cycle. So what we can glean from that is that the planet's significations, the sphere of life and of ourselves that it governs and kind of has this kind of correspondence to, that gets disrupted or reversed or somehow thrown out of whack. So Mercury rules communication, how we process information, how we metabolize information, the way we speak and communicate with one another in
Mm.
general. And also things like anything mercantile, like the exchange of goods or money, that kind of stuff, and technology stuff. These are all under the governance of Mercury. So essentially, when Mercury's orbit is disrupted in some way, when its normal path and speed, it gets slower, it stops, it turns around and goes the other way, there's a disruption to this sphere of stuff. So this looks like stumbling over your words or like blurting out something that you're like, gosh, I shouldn't have said that, and now I can't take it back, and I have this whole problem. Those kinds of things, these slip ups, or having to go back and redo something. This is why everyone's like, don't sign any contracts under Mercury retrograde.
Mm.
Because it's a typical time to like miss something in the fine print. Like you read that, the information came in, and you didn't process it right because the mercurial process of processing that information was disrupted. So, and it's also just like technology stuff can go wrong. Like I have a friend who, like, he always seems to have computer issues right before a Mercury retrograde and always has to end up like replacing his laptop or like something
Hmm.
during the retrograde, and there's always something wrong. It always has to be sent back and a new part has to come in. So it's like this process of it taking longer than it would have normally because this cycle is disrupted. So people can be like, oh, I didn't mean to say that, Mercury's retrograde. And like, maybe it's true. But also, yeah, it's not really an excuse, but it is a time when we tend to have to go back and redo things or rethink something, reorganize it,
Right.
or do it twice. If
Yeah.
that kind of makes sense. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that definitely answered it. That I didn't know about the apparent phenomenon you're talking about. I didn't know about that makes perfect sense when thinking about the cosmos from a geocentric perspective and how the orbits would be totally different for each one and each planet, and it's particularly the 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 geometry is going to be different for those that are closer to the sun than where we're at. So that's interesting. So then only Venus and Mercury can retrograde then, or
Actually, every planet but the moon can, because the moon's the only one that's orbiting. Well, obviously the moon's a satellite, not a planet, but
Oh, so they all do measure. So they all
so Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, and even any sort of
okay. So
trans-Neptunian object or asteroid or Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, they all have retrograde cycles because the Earth laps them.
right.
Similar concept, but it just, the Earth laps them, essentially.
Oh, okay.
In their orbits around the sun.
Yeah, and I just had an interesting thought about about how even if someone were to use an excuse like, oh, Mercury's in retrograde, this is probably why this is happening. There can be a time then if everyone can be aware of the fact that sometimes we do misspeak, and sometimes our communication goes wrong. That's actually an important part of being human, and maybe it doesn't forgive. I don't know if it's just, I don't know if there'd be some astrologically defined, penal system or something where everyone has a free reign when Mercury's in retrograde to be lying and stuff. That'd be a wild fantasy world there. Or I don't know, maybe it's existed before. And
well, that's an interesting thought, isn't it? Like, I can't tell you how many times I've fantasized about being able to call work and be like, yeah, Saturn's activated for me this year in my 6th house of illness. And it's just like the aspect's exact today, so I can't come in. And my boss being like, totally get it. I've been there. And maybe that did happen at some point.
Yeah.
But I think you're right on the money, though. It's like, yeah, Mercury retrograde really might confuse you so much in the head that you say things you don't mean, or you're a jerk and you regret it. But it's like, you still have to be accountable for your behaviors. Yeah. So it's a good time to be aware of that and like think to yourself, like if I feel really irate and like I have to say this right now, maybe it's a good opportunity for me to slow down and say, do I need to say this right now in this way? Which is just a good thing to do anyway. And it also gives you an opportunity to give people some grace who maybe aren't aware of it. They're like, man, they must be really struggling with Mercury retrograde. I'm going to give them a little extra space.
And and that's the power of the story and the power of the myth in that is because if you didn't have that story, then there wouldn't be that built-in awareness of when you are observing the movements of the cosmos, you're actually, all these things from the archetypal psychological perspective, from my understanding is, all these things represent parts of our human consciousness, all these thoughts, all these existence. Even you can go even further, and I'm interested in kind of subscribe to certain beliefs of the whole, more of a kind of pantheist thing where and this is what physicists believe too, is that we're all the same, we all come from the same thing, right? So like you were talking about, like get the source text, get the source, like go to the root. Like that's kind of where I started doing when I started really questioning the Catholic beliefs that I was taught at an early age. I was like, what is this nonsense? Like, why do people believe in some of this stuff? Like, why do my parents believe? I asked them, and it's clear they don't really believe it, but why do they still subscribe to it? Like, why are they still, like, when I ask them the real hard questions, like you're saying, like I was the kid in grade school too, and I would get kicked out of the class sometimes. I was, I would get irritated when I knew that the teachers were lying, or that they would, they're just like, they're just frustrated. They're just like, or they just totally dismiss these really important fundamental questions that maybe they don't have the answers to. Maybe they've never questioned it. I don't know. But I would get me in some trouble sometimes when I'd be asking about it. But I started to think like, well, how did this become so prevalent? How did these become the thoughts and the beliefs? And how does that even change through time? And so I remember reading the Gnostic texts of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and one of those, going back to the source text. We're like, all right, well, what's the Bible? Where do these things come from? What did it even come from? What are the texts that it comes from? And one of the ones that I was really intrigued by was the Book of Enoch, which to me is mind blowing that this wasn't more. And granted, these are Gnostic texts, so they have a lot of different beliefs than some of the Christians that came after them. They're much more mystical, but the book of Enoch is Adam's grandson and Noah's grandfather, and it was him and Jesus and Mary are the only people to ascend in the flesh into heaven. It's just like, what? Seems like a pretty important part of this.
Yeah.
Like this is like really key, like to like and reading it, and he talks about how everyone is a star and talks about him climbing these like 7 mountains, these 7 dimensions up into space, and talking about seeing the elliptical nature of things and the spherical nature of stars and planets and stuff, and talking about how every soul is a star in the universe that has a match. And it's just like really beautiful mystical poetry and storytelling at this thing. And it was just like, whoa, it's like, and then thinking, well, why did they leave this out? I don't know. Well, what are the not, is it because, this is my theory, at least, is because it's empowering to the person to know that they are God, as opposed to God comes on an altar that you have to worship, and that God is without. You have to pray to the God. You don't pray. It's not within you. You're just an image of it, which is that might be like a crux of a lot of psychological issues. That idea that we're made in an image, and how people view images in our minds. And that's one thing I was listening about Hillman stuff earlier, like yesterday. He was talking about images and the images of psychosis, and the images of, depending on what images your brain thinks or feel or whatever it is, that determines whether or not you're crazy or sane, and they'll lock you up depending on images. It's all based on like what you see. And so I don't know I understand that sentiment and about looking back to the source. And I feel like with the internet and with this stuff, maybe the millennial generation, people with access to the internet are in a particular position to be the integral, like we're in the integral part of things where we're integrating all these older renaissances and revelations all together in this particular time, that the primal things are integrating with the mystical, which are integrating with the Renaissance and the intellectual. And so like we're talking about how astrology is touching all these things. I think you're talking about seeing this Renaissance that you didn't even know was there, and that's I think a lot of people have that feeling. At least I've felt that too. It's like, wait, this stuff has been going on forever. How come this hasn't, like, there's a reason why. I don't know. That's where my mind goes. It's like the systems are built in place to for particular reasons, and so we kind of have an opportunity to be learning all these new things. I think it's amazing. And I think it's a really fascinating, it's a really fascinating area of study of just understanding the cosmos. So like right now, you said retrograde, and you said some other term about it. Can you just like give us like I want to know a little bit more. I just want to get a little lesson here about things, because I've just seen some YouTube videos and I've seen a couple charts, but like all the planets, they're all Greek named, right? Is that, or do people use Roman and Greek? I know that's confusion sometimes.
Let's see here. I gotta think about this.
Sorry, this is where my mind. I go ask 5 different questions in one question. Sorry.
No. It's totally fine. You're like retrograde, Greek, Roman. It's totally fine.
Retrograde is Greek.
So one thing that's important to note, the archetypes, so like the meanings of the planets, it's not only rooted in their mythological counterpart, as far as like, right. The sun being Apollo. That's not, Apollo isn't the only place we get what the sun means in astrology. So regardless of kind of what the names are, and it's Greek, I'm pretty certain, regardless of what the names are, it's not the only place the symbolism comes from, which I think comes as a surprise to some people, because it seems like there's so much there. Like there's so much richness in this mythology, in this Greek mythology, that like, where else would it come from? But
Right.
It's not only that, it's definitely linked to that, but yeah. So there's like, I'm trying to think here, like, I'm actually, here's something interesting. So archetypal astrology is kind of how you came into this, because obviously
Yeah.
Becca Tarnas. Richard Tarnas is like the legend that began archetypal astrology as like a kind of
Right.
astrology. And there are different kinds of astrology. They're all rooted. Like you can see the common themes throughout all of them. They're not like totally different practices or anything. But archetypal astrology relies and draws heavily on the archetypes and the mythology behind the planets and with their associations with these gods and goddesses. And then there are types that developed more in like the 20th century, which is important to know. And then there are types that are more rooted in what we originally see in the Hellenistic source texts. Hellenistic astrology is what my practice is heavily rooted in. So like the mythological component is there, but it's like the symbolism is almost more pared down to where
Mm.
the stories, like I'll tell you this, like story is super important to me too. Like I think that the whole idea that, oh, it's just a myth or that's just a story is like totally underestimating the power of story and how much human beings
Mm.
need story to survive. Like it's such an integral part of how we operate. And you know, it's such an integral part of things like faith and belief and like finding meaning, just meaning making as a human being.
Right.
Story is such a huge part of that. You see it in every culture. That's why it's there in every culture. So being able to tell stories is like a huge part of why I love astrology so much, because it's like you don't have to make anything up. It's all there. The symbolic components are there, and you just give it a conduit. I'm just the person writing it or typing it or saying it, you know? So, so the way I use astrology draws more on kind of a pared down symbolism rather than going straight to, you know, Venus, Aphrodite, the goddess of love, that kind of
Mm-hmm.
thing. It's less based on like the image or story you might associate with that goddess and more based on kind of, yeah, more pared down, pure archetypal principles, such as, I'll give you an example since I used Venus. Venus as the principle of unification and things coming together, attracting together, and bonding. Versus, you could look at it in sort of a polarity pair with Mars, whose kind of essential principle is to sever, to break apart, to
Mm.
create discord rather than harmony, to create chaos rather than beauty. So there's like this very abstract like principle, like unification versus like separation.
Right.
And then you can like build out from that. You can also look at like things that are associated with Venus, as far as like a hermetic like chain of correspondences would go. So things that are beautiful or things that bring people together are all things kind of under the governance of Venus. Even like the color green, the color white, these are Venusian colors, et cetera, et cetera. So it's like that's kind of where I start with my astrological practice, if you will. Does that make
Sure.
sense?
Yeah. So you mentioned hermetic chain of, what did you say? Hermetic
Correspondences.
change of
Yeah.
correspondences. And that's hermetic is based on the hermeticism of Hermes. Is that what you're saying?
Mhm.
Okay, so
Yep.
and Hermes is which one? I'm not too
Hermes. Hermes is which one?
what did you
Hermes
say?
is Mercury, essentially.
Right. Okay. Hermes
Hermes
is Mercury.
Trismegistus, which means thrice great. It's
Yeah,
so
dude.
fancy.
I got that
I love it
book.
the most.
So I had it on my wish list, and it I think someone bought it for me on Amazon. I had the Trismegistus or whatever, like Hermes I have it over
Yeah.
there. I have started reading a little bit about it. It read a lot like the Bible. It's like, oh, this is,
It's a lot.
it's super
It's a
old
lot,
and
but like
super deep in their
Hermes
own.
Trismegistus is like the person that a lot of source texts attribute their information to.
Yeah.
They're like, Venus means this and Mars means this because Hermes Trismegistus told me psychically, which is like, okay, great. It's like so many other divinely inspired texts. But the whole
Corpus
idea is that
Hermeticum.
there's what?
Corpus Hermeticum. Yeah.
Yes.
Thanks Creative Rat in the chat for saying that. Yeah. That's the name
Oh, I
of the book.
forgot there was even a chat. Yes, Corpus Hermeticum, Hermes Trismegistus. Um,
So the
yeah,
chain of
so
that's that. What's the chain then?
So the Hermetic chain of correspondences is the idea of the following. So there are these different, so cosmologically, the idea that there are these different spheres. There's the sublunar sphere, which is Earth and
Mm.
humans and everything on Earth, minerals, animals, stuff, human things. And then the very farthest out, there is the fixed stars and beyond it, just like the ether. The prime mover is what they
Mm.
called it. And it's like out there, that's like the most divine, that's the most pure. And it's like the closer you get to Earth, the more imperfect, the less divine things get. And part of what was considered kind of like a trademark of something having more divinity or more perfection in that way would be for it to be more consistent, less movement and change, more unchanging, more eternal. And then the things closer to Earth, things like, plants that like grow and bloom and then wither and die, like those are less perfect things. They're not as archetypally perfect. So the spheres, each of the planets had a sphere. So the moon was the first one around the Earth. Second was Mercury, then Venus, then the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, then the fixed stars, then the prime mover. So the idea is that each of these kind of different layers, there's like the layer of the fixed stars, which is like almost the most divine, and then the layer of each planet was more divine than anything below it. And each planet was kind of like it's totally the classic idea of like white light being put through a prism and like
Sure.
all these different things. So the idea was that different planets were linked in this chain of correspondences by their essential nature. So the idea that, like, since we were talking about Venus, we'll talk about that again. Venus having likeness or similarity and correspondence to things like the blooming part of a plant, like the beautiful, colorful, harmonious Venusian part of a plant. Venus ruling things like music, Venus ruling people who had Venusian qualities. So you would think artists, those would be in the chain of correspondences. And then there would be like the level of different animals or whatever. I think rabbits are Venusian. There are literally texts with like correspondences, like lists of correspondences. Like I can link you one by William Lilly if you're into reading super dry things like that. But then it would go down into like minerals associated with Venus that correspond with Venus due to either their nature, the way they look, the things that they're used for, the things they do. So like green stones, white stones, etc. And this basically creates this chain that goes through like all these different levels, from spirit to human to plant, animal, mineral, all the way down to like the smallest particle. It's, to put it really simply, it's the idea that planetary energy aligns with and corresponds with things on Earth. I would also refer to this, just in normal conversation, as a planet ruling something. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I've heard that before, and that makes sense. Yeah, the source text will only talk about Mars and Jupiter stuff and Saturn, or is it because how much we've been, from my understanding, a lot of the planets have been discovered more recently, and that's, I mean, I don't know if that's true. I don't know. I mean, who knows?
Yeah.
I know that we got some intense fucking telescopes now, but
Yeah.
I mean, they're building one right now. The James Webb telescope, is that what it is? That's going out. It's like 10 times the size of Hubble, and it's all radio. They're like a radiation telescope, and they're going to be able to look like before the Big Bang or some shit. Like, based on radioactive decay, they can like turn the clock back on time and try and figure out what the universe is like before. That's mind blowing. I don't know. I'm
Wow.
but so, man, yeah, there is an infinite amount of things out there. That's an interesting concept, because I've always likened it to, like, we understand gravity, and now people are talking about, well, what's the unified theory of things? Well, it's applied gravity to somehow combine quantum theory and gravity, and then you're going to get this unified thing, because that's the two worldviews, is because people are using quantum mechanics as, like, I don't know, it's as like proof for a lot of ancient mysticism and stuff. People are like, oh, all these stories and all these things that people have been talking about back then about how everything is just constantly a paradox, and it's all the observer effect and stuff. It's interesting to see that, because it shows you the human perspective of things. But thanks for explaining that Hermetic chain of correspondence. Nailed it.
I kind of butchered it, but you're welcome.
No, yeah, I understand it. So, but based on the fields, is that how the hierarchy of the fields is around the Earth, the way you're describing it? Does that signify the magnitude of power that it has to rule? Like, the further you are, but because you're saying the further you are, the more divine and the more eternal. Is that just because they're further away, or like what did they describe why? What makes something more eternal? Is it just because why would the sun be more eternal than Saturn or something?
Right. Good question. So the reason they're in that order, the reason the planets are in that order, it's called the Chaldean order, if you want a fancy word for it. It's due to their planetary speed from Earth. So you can look at it just as from like how far away from the sun they are. So Saturn is the farthest away from the sun of the visible planets, because there are planets you can't see with the naked eye, like Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. You can see Uranus with the naked eye under very specific conditions, but don't at me. Saturn's the last one. So Saturn moves very slowly. So Saturn was seen as, in that way, more unchanging than, say, Mercury or Venus. So the concerns or significations of Saturn, number one, are like with kind of bigger kind of concepts. So rather than being like interpersonal kind of concepts like attraction or communication or whatever, they're more kind of like social ideas, like where you fit socially, etc. And there are other significations as well. But speed is the main thing. Saturn moves really, really slow throughout the zodiac. So that's part of why. That doesn't mean that Saturn has more power to affect things necessarily than, say, Mercury or Venus. The planets and their kind of spheres that not overlap, but are concentric like an onion. That's kind of like a set of like power, if you will.
Sure.
So Saturn's not like more powerful than the inner planets, for example. So I hope that kind of answers your question.
Yeah. No, I didn't.
Very much speed based.
Okay. So one of the questions I have was, if we become a multiplanetary faring species and move,
I knew this was coming.
Yeah. If we live on Mars, so we live on Mars, does Earth now rule Mars? And does Earth rule Earth? You know what? Like, I
Yes.
get, and I'm sure this fits into what you're talking about at the speed, right? Because in relation to Earth, how fast does the Earth move? Probably not at all, right? Very slow, like negligible amounts of speed. So but you said it's not necessarily like that. That determines the order, but that doesn't necessarily determine the power. So like,
right.
I don't know, is that factored into to astrological analysis, is Earth itself, like, and its movements, or is it because it's all related to everything? But does the Earth, isn't, yeah.
I think I understand your question. So Earth is not factored into what we would look at in like an astrological chart, because the Earth is the center. That's where,
Right.
that is,
It's the center of the universe, baby.
right. It's where you're casting from. So if someone were born on Mars and you wanted to look at their astrology chart, it would be a Mars-centric chart, and the Earth would be somewhere in that chart.
Okay.
Because essentially it's just a projection of like where all the celestial bodies were relative to the central point. So yeah, the Earth there, it's not factored in because it's like the grounding point. It's like where you're doing it from. So,
but if you were on Mars, what myth or what archetype would Earth serve, do you think, if you were on Mars? I know this is probably
No, I have a friend. You should talk to my friend Cameron White. He is he's an astrologer as well. He's obsessed with this concept. Okay. The fact is, in my opinion, it would be, what was that?
I didn't just think of it right now. I wasn't the first one.
Oh, yeah. I hate to break it to you. Yeah, because it's a really fascinating question. Yeah. It would be a whole new astrology, essentially. Yeah. We could certainly take the starting points of like, well, maybe Venus means the same thing, but what you have to, on Mars as it does on Earth, but what you have to take into consideration is the idea that there is so much symbolism that's gleaned from how these planets, how these celestial bodies are seen from your location. Mars is red from Earth. That has so much to do with Mars's significations. It's not just that it's red, but it's all part of the many layers of symbolism that come together to try to express this pure archetype. So if you totally transplant to a new place, you'd have to take in those new considerations. So like, what are the visible considerations that are new on Mars that are not the same as they were on Earth for, say, Venus? What is Venus's orbit like in a Mars-centric kind of universe? You know what I mean? Yeah. If you were to look at it from as the other movements as apparent phenomena relative to Mars. So you would have to take all that into consideration, and you'd have to do a lot of empirical observation. Like, you just have to do a lot of that and just see what happens. And, astrologers are always doing that. I'm always doing that with my clients and saying, like, here is what the symbolism says about this year of your life. Let me know how that pans out. Because there's a spectrum of potential manifestations of the symbolism. I sure there are some practitioners who do claim they can predict things exactly as they'll happen, exactly when they'll happen. I'm not one of those people. I'm not interested in doing that at all. But you can see things manifest in alignment with the symbolism. That's part of the point, is, having that awareness. And so we would just have to make some speculations and see what happened. We would just have to observe, and using the symbolic kind of framework and the critical thinking that astrology teaches you to do. I mean, hopefully you know how to do critical thinking before astrology, but like, use that symbolic integrity and that internal logic to observe what's happening in that Mars-centric chart and go from there. Yeah. There would have to be so much experimentation, essentially.
Then we'd need a whole new, you need to start making the source text, for.
Exactly. We'd be the authors.
Hermetic, Hermes,
Hermes Trismegistus. Maybe we could get, like, instead of thrice great, like, whatever, four times.
Yeah, quad, right? Yeah, Quadmegistus. I can't even say.
Quadmegistus. Has a ring to it.
Yeah, it's got a good, we're onto something.
Yeah.
Okay, so you mentioned your practice and your clients and stuff. So, and I came onto your Twitch once, and you were messing around with charts, and my understanding. So you get someone's birth date, location, and time, and then you can map out all of these different precessions and movements of all the planets and different significant, bodies and transits, and they all move in these particular ways, and there's different terms for the different patterns of movement, right? And move away, move to something, moves together, and then they square, or they I don't know. There's lots of different things that I'm not.
You're doing great.
Yeah, thank you. I'm learning some words. I just throw some words out, and yeah. So how is that then? Like you say you ask your clients and stuff for that. Is how is it putting it into applied practice as opposed to theory and more your personal thing? Like, how has that changed from implementing it as a practice, like engaged with other people? Like, is that, I would imagine it, it's a much larger amount of information you can work from, and people probably can be helpful or not in that, in furthering your own or deepening your own understanding. But yeah, I don't know. Can you tell me, like, what's your, like, what do you do with that, and what do clients usually like respond for how, what's like a typical interaction, and what do you get from it?
Well, so a lot of times people come to me kind of when they're at a crossroads, or when there's like a lot of change in their life, or they want some kind of direction.
Right.
Like they need the assistance of, like, they need story. They need something more than just understanding that they're 28 and like life's hard. Like they want something more than that. They want some direction from like something bigger, something more divine. So a lot of times they're at a crossroads and they want advice on like their career or something, or like relationships. But sometimes people just want a deeper understanding of themselves, and they want to know kind of where they are in their own personal timeline. And, if things will stop feeling so hard soon, or like when things will feel better, et cetera, et cetera. And so like a typical consultation, it's usually going to be where we go over their personal birth chart, and we look at each placement and the themes and patterns to get answers to questions like, why am I like this? Like, why do I keep doing this? Like, where are, the classic, like, what are my strengths and weaknesses kind of stuff. And kind of understanding your own story, what kind of like patterns you have, so you can align with your potential. Because the idea is that like each placement, not any one is necessarily better than the other. There's a manifestation of a placement, say, as, you're a Taurus. That means the sun was in the sign Taurus when you were born. There are the really skilled manifestations, or like what some people will call evolved. I frankly hate that, designation of evolved versus unevolved. That makes things seem really linear, and they're not. But kind of like skilled manifestations and unskilled manifestations. So a really high expression of Taurus energy would be someone really artistic, creative, someone who is stable and reliable, dependable, really connected to the sensual dimension of life, like the idea of things you experience with your five senses. I'm obviously mentioning music because you're literally a musician, so that's definitely a part of it for you. But just the idea of like quality and luxury, and like the really good things in life, and being able to like enjoy them. And then some more kind of on the other side of the spectrum would be the idea that this energy can get really stubborn, can get really fixated, can get really like digging in their heels and like wanting it their way. That kind of energy where there's not really room for movement. The steady pace turns into unmoving or stagnation, or just putting on blinders and being unwilling to see it any other way. So there are there's a lot of room for different ways these things can express. And the idea is when you understand what you're working with, what your baseline is, you can have more awareness and make better choices. Right. So for example, if you know that you're that you have this predisposition to kind of like challenge other people and their beliefs or views, or blurt things out and then kind of regret saying them, or like not know when to stop, like with the, you know, verbal sparring matches that you start for whatever reason. You know the potential of something like a placement that might indicate that, so you can make choices on, will I use this kind of energy to really get to the heart of matters, to like to make me ambitious with the way I go after information and things that are important to me, and like speak up for what I believe in? And will I stop and take a breath before this turns into something that harms someone or hurts their feelings or causes unnecessary suffering? Then you know the potential, and you can make choices about it. Right. And kind of use it for the most good. So it's like, that's what I help people identify. It's like, what's your baseline? What are you working with? How can you align with that? Where is it causing you problems? And how can you avoid those problems? How can you encounter those problems if they are truly inevitable, and be able to move through them with more grace and less suffering and less turmoil? Like, life gets really hard sometimes. It's good to have tools for knowing how to cope with that, you know, and feeling like there's more of a reason than just like, I guess life is just terrible, because that's a bad feeling. And it feels that way sometimes. It feels good to be able to at least say, well, the cosmos is reflecting this really hard time, and it's still hard, but I know it seems like there's more meaning. It seems like there's more purpose, there's more connection, rather than, I guess life is just suffering, which is a really bad place to be. So
yeah, I mean, it sounds like what you're practicing is encouraging like awareness, and almost every big buzzword of mindfulness, of just like, hey, just know that these energies are in you, and might be stronger in you in particular than maybe some other folks. And depending on, because this is what you're ruled by, and so you might as well be aware of these things that could be really the driver behind all your action, and all your, maybe even your belief system and stuff, and how you implement it and things. So I mean, that makes sense. I mean, I think I like that. I like that a lot, about the understanding of how people come to you to get the stories. I mean, I relate to that in a sense of like, people come into the music, and I weave some stories and tell some things about I've made up my own little myths here and there, or own stories of this person or that doing this or that, and people can find purpose and meaning in that. And that's so profound. I didn't even understand. It was just for my own benefit, really, like growing up, and just being like my own art therapy, really, just like trying to make sense of reality, and then sharing it with people. If I realized that other people feel these same things too, or if they don't, they feel the same energies through the song, and they have their own awakenings or their own connections, like you're saying. And so that's part of, it kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about seeing astrology as a tool for storytelling, and as a tool that's, go back to what we were saying, been here for a very long time. And that's what I've been realizing more and more, as I've been getting older, is like the myths of the modern era being the best and the greatest, and how we have the best, because we can communicate like magic right now. Like, I'm just looking at a screen, and you're halfway across the country, but like, those are amazing things. But there are other aspects of society that we can look into history and see, like what you mentioned, that the source texts are from Egypt, right? A Hellenistic time in Egypt, and Egypt has been like the whole the whole span of Egypt is like what 6,000 years or something, like crazy. Like we like 6,000 years. We can't even imagine that. I can't even. Is like what 200, 300 years old. I don't know.
There are
Like,
literally bonsai trees that are older than
yeah.
America. Like it's
So
much less an empire. Yeah, it's crazy.
yeah, and I don't know. So the would I'd be remiss to ask then a little bit about like what's happening now. And I tuned into Becca's conversation about Saturn Pluto on Zoom, and that was pretty. I mean, just talking about the Chronos archetype and the Pluto archetype about time and reality, master of time, the king or the father of gods, and versus with the death rebirth cycle, and the corresponding with all the different pandemics and disease outbreaks and stuff. So like, how does that all interact with Taurus? There's a couple of questions that everything was, I'm still learning some of this stuff. So there's a lot of things that I'm missing and I'm probably misinterpreting or things. But from my understanding, the coronation aspects of things, that had something to do with Jupiter, or Jupiter is like a noble or something. Is that correct? Or maybe I'm thinking of something else. Because there was like Mars.
Which aspects were you talking about?
Coronation. I don't know. That's what they were calling it, coronation, like a crowning, like a royal thing. Like royalty is Jupiter is royalty or something. I don't know if I'm misremembering or if I'm
Yeah. I mean, I'm not sure. I did not tune in for that. I wish I could have, but yeah, I'm not sure. Jupiter is usually a very noble archetype, like the priest, yeah. Or like or like a noble person. Jupiter rules things like wealth and stuff like that. I think for something like kingship, we'd look more to the sun. So I just don't know exactly the context they were talking about. I know Saturn Pluto for sure. That's something like Rick Tarnas wrote about in Cosmos and Psyche. So like, I remember like literally all my like colleagues and friends like grabbing their copies of Cosmos and Psyche and like looking at the Saturn Pluto like stuff. Because what you can do is you can go back to different times in history when Saturn and Pluto were conjoined or configured to each other in some way and go, okay, how do these stories manifest? And yeah, unfortunately, a lot of times it's with, disease and like lots of hardship, lots of really heavy stories, lots of really heavy events in human history.
Pluto bringing heavy shit everywhere it goes? Is that just what it does?
Yep.
Just kills things?
Pretty much.
And just kills things really, and lets them become
kills
reborn.
It as in like the phoenix and then it rises from the ashes.
Right. It's not an end, it's a rebirth.
Yeah, the idea that like death is a beginning.
Yeah. I'm making that assumption already.
Right.
Yeah, that's the thing I try to remember to tell people, those concepts, because that's something that I found really powerful. Yeah, the looking at opposites as equals, like you have to, you can't, and it's the yin yang, like it's the same. They rely on each other. They're dependent on each other. They're
constantly becoming one another.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So can you elaborate maybe a little bit, because I'm kind of talking about some things that doesn't really have any context. But what I was getting to was about the time now with coronavirus and everyone is stuck at home, and I'm sure people are very confused and very scared, and everyone wants some answers, or at least like some stories that they can look to, and I don't know. So what's like happening right now? Like what with the transits, and is that the right thing to say? The transits? Okay. Transits just things moving, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Transits are just kind of like, where are the planets right now? How are they configured to, exactly. The transits, that's the perfect way to say it.
Okay.
So the thing about really big events, especially things that affect the whole world, what happens, there's a concept of like a moment, or the chart, like the transits of a moment in time subsuming other transits. And there's actually a podcast that kind of went into more detail about this concept. I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but like the idea that like a moment in time, kind of like the idea of like, okay, the birth chart for an entire country, like whatever you're doing, whatever you are engaging with, however your life's going, is subsumed by whatever is happening to that country's birth chart, if you will. So what's happening with coronavirus is this is global. You know what I mean? So it's hard to necessarily, I mean, we can definitely link it to the Saturn Pluto conjunction and that cycle, which that was in January. That was January 12th, that aspect became exact, or perfected is another way to put that. And what we're dealing with is kind of like the shock waves of that, because that transit, there's a lot of buildup to it. Depending on the scope you want to look at, it was years of buildup. And so there will be results and sort of aftermath and consequences that echo out from that exactness, because it's only April, you know, from January.
Doesn't it go square? So, they touch each other again, right? Or they can connect in another pattern, right? They continue to like things are always.
Yeah, they'll connect in other ways. That the like epicenter, if you will, of this interaction has already happened. That was in January, but like they're still so close together, and they will get even closer together before actually getting more distance between these two planetary bodies later this year. So we're dealing with the aftershocks of that kind of stuff. And I think what we're really seeing, as far as like, well, what's going on with the planets and everyone's quarantined and all this stuff and people are going crazy, it's really a matter of making sure we keep in mind that we're still experiencing something from a configuration that meant that much and had that big of an impact, that even though that was in January, we can still look to it now and say, holy crap, this is still happening. But additionally, other than Saturn and Pluto, the planets Mars and Jupiter are involved too. Back in January and February, Jupiter moved into the same zodiac sign as Pluto and Saturn, which is Capricorn, in December of last year. That shifted, number one, more emphasis to this area of the zodiac and of our charts. And it also kind of gave the planet Jupiter different resources to do what Jupiter tries to do. So Jupiter tries to be a helpful planet generally. It's of a benevolent nature. And in Capricorn, it just doesn't have very many resources to help. So I have written about this multiple times, but kind of the story or the image that I see when I think about this combination between planet and sign is like a field medic. Like it's a person with skills and training and the desire and motivation to help, to heal people, but in circumstances that are like a war-torn country, a battlefield. There aren't very many supplies. There's not a lot to work with. You can't save everyone. Like you can't. That would be ideal, but you have to use the tools you have. And since you're a Tolkien person, maybe you'll appreciate this too. I wrote about how Aragorn, after the Battle of Pelennor Fields, like sneaks into Minas Tirith to go to the Houses of Healing to help Éowyn and Merry and Faramir. He's like, I'm not claiming the kingship yet. Don't tell anybody who I am. Like there is no assuming of nobility. There's no taking the crown. It's going in and you, after literally like no sleep, no anything, battle for days, after the Paths of the Dead too. Like, don't even get me started. That's so much more terrifying in the book. But he goes in to heal his friends. So there is this almost self-sacrificial putting of other people first. Like there's nothing more important than going in there and saving those people. And he does it even with like the humble Kingsfoil. Like this plant they just keep around for headaches. They've lost that old wisdom, but he has this noble blood and he knows how to use these white flowers, this herb, and he literally calls them back from death's doorstep. So the idea of a noble person, like the imagery archetype of a noble person with very limited resources, really at the end of their rope, still prioritizing what's in, their heart, which is to heal and to help. So we have Jupiter now in this area. Number one, emphasizing Capricorn. Number two, kind of like a field medic or someone with not a lot of resources, but all the desire to help. Then Mars moved into Capricorn too. And Mars really doesn't give a shit about helping anyone.
Right.
That's not the archetype that's present. It's really about like the will to assert yourself based on desire and action, and this very aggressive quality, the idea of like conflict and anger, and like how you process those, how we process them collectively, how we act on those things. And Mars, with Capricorn resources, the Mars archetype does great on a battlefield, right at home in a war-torn country. Where's the action? Where's the fighting? Like, that's where Mars knows what to do. So you have even more emphasis on this one part of the chart, which is already been the scene, setting the scene with Saturn and Pluto there for years. Then you get a concentration of more energy there. And what you get is it gets activated. It's like the scales finally tip and something finally happens. And it's like, boom, consequences. So all of that really piled up and kind of echoed throughout February and March. And now Saturn and Mars both have moved into the sign of Aquarius, the next sign, together. And when those two planets are together, their energies are very harsh. They're not the most benevolent archetypes. They're actually quite the opposite. So there are a lot of challenges that come up when these two planets come together, regardless of where they are. It's just one thing after another, like a perfect storm, astrologically. Because they're even configured to the planet Uranus, which is all about like revelation and surprise and disruption, completely unpredictable, results. So there is so much tension. There is so much energy that like needs an outlet, and like is aggressive by nature, or is demanding or coarse, or doesn't feel good by nature. That's all like in a pressure cooker right now. And I think that's reflecting, number one, how many challenges people are going through. When Mars and Saturn come together, we see major challenges. So like people losing their jobs, people unable to go to work, people, God forbid, getting sick and like really being at risk, people who are, now we're seeing protests, like open everything back up, blah, blah, blah. People, the most fortunate of us, just really restless, being cooped up at home, all this energy and nowhere to put it, feeling restricted, feeling conflicted. So Mars and Saturn are definitely somewhere to look for how we're all feeling right now and what we're all going through. These two archetypes, like I said, doesn't matter where or when, they bring challenges with them. And, it's possible to overcome challenges, but, sometimes those are parts of life that just suck. Yeah. I'm not the kind of astrologer that's going to be like, everything can be whatever you want it to be with more awareness and you can choose. But like, sometimes you can't. Sometimes you go through really hard shit. And that's what we're going through right now.
Yeah, I always try to think of like, it's the, like I was saying before, they're functions of each other. So you like, it's a requirement in order to have a happy time, is you have to have a pretty challenging and harsh and sad time. That they're so dependent on each other. But when you're in it, it doesn't feel so nice, and it feels like it goes on forever. Sometimes, like the eternal suffering of Hades, right? Like that it's there for for eternity. But that's why it could be that's why it's an interesting tool. So if you look at these patterns and you look at the transits, you can see, okay, the story is we've been here before and we're going to leave, and going to cut, or, these movements and these energies and these archetypes have ruled, what's happening on Earth, and they'll, change in the future, and they'll continue to change, and everything will always be changing and moving, and perhaps, in this particular nature that we've observed. And we know that they move in these particular ways. That's pretty freaking obvious. Like everyone, like that's pretty down. I mean, everyone knows that this shit moves around, man. Like That's for sure. So we know that. That's interesting. I remember one time, and this is maybe a little it's kind of in a different direction conversation, but one of the first times that I experienced someone was following their own astrology, but they were a daily horoscope person, and I've met people who, and that kind of, maybe it was because I had a lack of awareness too of an understanding, but I remember this one time it really stuck with me, and it kind of right when I just started to get exposed to the ideas of astrology, and one person was like, "Oh, you're Taurus? Like, we can't be friends." And then turned around and like walked away. I was like, "Oh my God, like what? Like this is like, okay, whatever belief system they have, that's not obviously not correct, you know." So it kind of stalled my understanding of it, and stalled my curiosity by being kind of repulsed by this particular belief. And then only till recently, my friend was telling me about how, oh no, like that's just your sun. Like there's also these not a million, but there's also a wide variety of different types of stories and energies and feelings that go into people's what did you call it, an astrological chart or
chart. Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
natal chart.
Natal chart. Yeah, natal. That just means like where you were born, right?
Yeah, it's synonymous with calling it a birth chart.
Okay. Yeah, like natal
prenatal
prenatal
just means birth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I had a question too about my birth, because I have I'm waiting for the time. We're gonna wait to see what the time is, but it seems to be around 2:30 p.m. or something. But the main 2:30. The main question that we have is because my mom said that I had I came out head first, but my shoulders were stuck, and then they ended up through the vaginal canal, but then they ended up cutting her open with a C-section and taking me out that way, and that was over a period of time. Mm-hmm. So like there's multiple breaches. So then the question is like, okay, well, what if birth lasts 6 hours, or what if you come out once and come back in and come out again? Like, how do you know which one's which? How do you know which one to use? Like, how do you know?
Yeah, so the movements got me for some reason.
I'm reenacting it.
I don't know why that was so funny. Yes, great question. When you are born, like officially, fully, like umbilical cord cut, when you're born, pronounced born for real, for realsies, because that's when it's like you become
full
separate
body birth, full body breach in birth.
Yes, precisely. It's a technical term. But yeah, when you're fully born, because the idea is like that's when your life begins as an entity separate from your mother, fully separate.
So the umbilical cord is important part of that. Okay, that makes sense.
Right, because it's like it's not like they cut the umbilical cord and then like whoop, and then they decided to do the C-section. Like there was a moment finally when you were completely born, and it was like there is no more birthing to be happening now. When the birth process is done. So yeah,
gotcha. That makes sense. I wasn't sure if it was upon first breach. I don't know. The first.
It's not upon first breach, but that's a really common question. Okay. And some people are like, "Well, what about conception? You know, what about when you're conceived?" And I'm like, "Good luck finding out exactly when you were conceived, the exact day, month, year, and time. Like, good luck." But yeah, it's just when you fully become separate. So yeah, I would say if you do end up getting your actual birth record back, I would trust the time on that if there is a time. Yeah. But yeah, 2:30-ish.
Yeah, that's what's both my dad corroborated that it's early afternoon, like from 1 to 2:30, like 1 to 3 area. And that's kind of what my mom has been saying. One, she knows it was light out. She knows it was the afternoon.
Got it.
But yeah, waiting for the actual record. I braved the COVID and put on my mask and dropped it off at the clinic where I was born, which is luckily close to where I live. So, and I sent and I had to go all around different places. It's a weird world in the hospital now. Like you walk in and everyone has these plastic barriers of like plexiglass. So you have to talk to people through these barriers, like which I don't know, it makes sense. The whole thing is crazy. I mean, but now the data, there's more and more data coming out, and I think the more we start to actually observe this novel virus, like the more we'll actually understand what's happening. Because I've been reading about new studies coming out in California that are showing mortality rates way lower, but of course it has to be corroborated, and we've yet to see, and maybe it's dependent on climate and stuff too. There's all these studies and all the data, and because I was watching when this stuff first happened, like when people were starting to talk about quarantining and things, and then finally the state, the governor went through with it and was like, yeah, shelter in place. But when looking at all the data from day to day and how it's all moving and all the numbers and all the graphs painting their own stories of like what this virus is and what it can, some of these graphs will change in 2 days, and some of this major data that you've been making huge decisions about your life or about how you're gonna be afraid of this or not, or how much caution to exercise or how much to not, or on a day-to-day basis. And I can understand how people are just sick of it or are desperate. Even could be like, I need health insurance, I need the job, I need to do all these things. And I like the idea of the Saturn Pluto, and that makes sense about how it feels a little bit like we're in an underworld type situation. Like it feels like that to a degree, like everyone's a lot. I don't know, that time and reality is kind of being reborn, and that I think a lot of, I don't know, people are becoming at least more aware of those types of energies. I would imagine, because I don't think this has ever happened at this scale, because like what really threw me off was I was kind of like going into it, be like, okay, I'm just going to stick with the core group of people. I was still going to quarantine, but like still see a couple people. I had planned on that. And then I had I had a conversation with some of my friends in France and England, and they had been already quarantined for like a week or 2 weeks. And I was just like, whoa, oh my God, like this is across the world. Like people are exercising caution everywhere. And it's like, oh man, well, there are worse things than just, and maybe there's some astrological sense of this, where I've been feeling like I'm back in high school again. Like this is crazy, because I can't go out to parties, because I never went to parties in high school. I can't date anyone. I've never dated anyone in high school. And I'm just
I didn't either.
And I'm
Can
just,
relate.
yeah. And I'm just at home, like doing my music and building new computers and just, so it just feels like that. I don't know. It feels like a return to that for some reason. Like, but then, I mean, everyone's got high school issues. This is one of my most recurring dreams of like stress is I didn't end up graduating high school. Like that was and I had to like show up in the school, and I have to like go talk to the administrators and be like, yeah, like you still have to take this class. Like you didn't do it. Even though I already have advanced degrees of, I'm still like freaking out about how I didn't pass high school. And I've woken up with that being like, oh my God, I forgot to do. That shows you how much stress academics can put on people, and like, that. But I don't know. Yeah, it's an interesting time. The whole thing converging around. Well, okay, so I guess I want to clarify a term. When things are aligned, because I think of like. Mm-hmm. In Hercules, Disney Hercules, when it's like when the planets are aligned, and they just have all the planets and they all form like a giant beam of energy that just shoots, and it releases the Titans, I guess, or no, what does it do? I forget what it does. But that's Kronos, and that's all these people being released, right? And so they're I don't know, they might have consulted some astrologers for that, I would imagine, right? Something to make. Because I don't know if you know the scene I'm talking about. And
I love that movie so much.
It's a great
I need
movie.
to watch it again so bad. I love the music from it so much.
Yeah, the music's great.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. Oh my gosh. Wow. I'm overcome with nostalgia. Yes. So, like, as far as aligning, it's not usually all the planets just in one line like that.
Right. Obviously,
Like from like a visible standpoint, but
but they all
there are
come in the
different.
same. They go into the same constellation relative to where our observation, right? And so, and you're saying that just recently it's been 4,
Mhm.
in Capricorn,
Mhm.
and so when I don't know what can we expect then? Like, when is this gonna be over, man? What when are we when does Saturn get reborn
When does
fully?
Saturn
When
fuck right
is when
off? That's a
is
good question.
when's Saturn's second breach birth?
Uh, um, it's a complicated answer because it's
Yeah,
complex. But as far as like the brunt of it, like this part of it that sucks a lot right now, I can tell you this: it's going to it's going to feel a lot better by the end of the year. And then that's going to have its own, 2021 is going to have its own set of
mm-hmm.
challenges and stuff like that. But what Saturn's going to do over the course of the rest of this year, I'm going to talk about Saturn because Saturn, one of the essential principles of Saturn is limitation and like boundaries and rules. And so anytime
Mm-hmm.
we look to people feeling confined or like isolated, those are Saturnian principles. So that could mean like you're isolated because you went to live in the Tibetan mountains and meditate for 30 years, or it could mean you're trapped inside because there's a pandemic. One of those is more choice based than the other. But Saturn is kind of the major player here when we look at confinement or limitation or feeling imprisoned, trapped. So Saturn moved into the sign Aquarius, but Saturn's direct motion will stop and Saturn will go retrograde. Saturn will go back to Capricorn, get in proximity of Pluto again. So, it's going to
Second
be
wave.
revisiting some of the themes that were so potent, especially right at the turn of the year. And then we'll move back into Aquarius again in December. When it moves into Aquarius the second time, so the first time this happened was at the end of March with Mars, god of war, god of fucking shit up, literally, like the planet that just likes to cause chaos and really inflame situations. In December, Saturn will cross that threshold with the planet Jupiter. So Jupiter, the one that wants to help, this
Right.
naturally benevolent planet who has not had very many resources for the past year and a half, will be in a much better position. And the way one astrologer put it, and I really loved how he said this, it was like the Mars and Saturn phase that we're in right now is like the flash forward to the catastrophic future that we have a chance to go back in time and prevent, if you will. He mentioned the Terminator movies. I've never seen them. So if there's like a Terminator flash forward, it flashes back and you have to save this person to prevent the catastrophic outcome or whatever, please refer to that in your mind if you know what that is. But Mars and Jupiter in January is going to be kind of like a reparative phase or like a phase where it's like, okay, we know this territory, we know how to navigate it better, we can do it better. It doesn't feel like it doesn't feel so confining and so constricting and terrible because like Jupiter is the planet of expansion and like broadening your perspectives and your horizons, both mentally and actually. There is a sense of freedom and space with Jupiter. So put that with Saturn, the Lord of time, the Lord of limits, the constraints of time and space. And you get kind of a reimagining of boundaries. You get boundaries in new places. And I think it'll feel like we're all talking about the new normal right now, right?
Yeah.
Astrologers have been anticipating Saturn moving into Aquarius for a really long time. The last time Saturn was in Aquarius was like 28 years ago, like when we were born. And so it's a big shift. It's a big change. Saturn spends like 2.5 years in one zodiac sign. So these are decent chunks of time. So it's like, oh, it's going to be a new phase, and it's going to be kind of a new energetic phase for a lot of other technical reasons I don't like want to delve into because I think it might sound kind of boring, but the new normal is going to feel like we're getting kind of a preview of it right now. We're all really jarred by what's going on. And I think in December, there's going to be more hope. There's going to be, it's not going to feel as bad. You know what I mean? So December is something to look for. There are some challenges upcoming for the fall of this year. Mars and Saturn are going to be configured to each other again in a way that's not super fun. So hang in there, everyone. December is going to feel better, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, because it seems like everything's, well, everyone knows and is experiencing it, but I've been texting and chatting with folks in the industry, at least, and in the music industry, and because I had whole tours set, and I was actually going right by where Becca was, and I was like considering, like, on my tour on my birthday, like getting a consultation or something, like, and I was like,
oh my gosh,
that would have been great, but obviously not in the stars, but the industry is, people have been seeing, like, people have things that are rescheduled to August, like tours and stuff, but I've been hearing people that aren't even thinking about rescheduling until after the new year. And and that's what everyone seems to be like, the safe bet. It was like, so you don't have to keep rescheduling. And I'm just waiting because I don't have a booking agent or anything, so I've been doing everything myself, and I already have to reschedule a tour once. I'm not going to do it twice. Like, fuck that. I'm just going to wait. But
yeah.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, that makes sense. I mean, in terms of the movements though, so Aquarius, that's another big question that I've had. I mean, I've heard this is the dawning of the age of the Aquarius. Like, everyone knows that, and I've heard that, and I understand, like, the zodiac, the great age, right? Like the great age of, like, these big, what is it, like thousands of years of where, and that is Earth moving into a different constellation, but everything's geocentric. So, like, what determines that? Because I remember looking it up and getting a million different responses as to when we're entering into Aquarius, and if it's so like varied in what people think we are, like, how do we know we're not in there now? How do we know we haven't been in there for like thousands of years already? Is that
exactly? This is one of those things where, like, I kind of glaze over if I'm like, oh yeah, I'm an astrologer, and people are like, oh my gosh, I'm into astrology too. Age of Aquarius. Yeah, I'm just like, okay. It's just so rare that I can find anyone who touts something like the Age of Aquarius and actually knows anything about what that means.
Right. It's a great song though.
Yes. Oh yeah, love it. I'm here for that, man. But yeah, so the idea is connected to the precession of the equinoxes.
Right.
You're correct. That is the basic idea of that, is that from Earth, the fixed stars, there's a reason they're called fixed, is because, they don't move. Unlike some stars, like the planets, which seem to move against the backdrop of the fixed stars. Anyway, so the fixed stars do shift, though, very slowly. And the reason is because Earth's axis is tilted.
Right.
So it's like a slow...
It's a wobble.
Everyone calls it a wobble, and that didn't make any sense to me for so long. They're like a top, and like I just imagine a top completely vertical spinning, and I'm like, thank you, that tells me nothing. But the Earth's axis slowly moves. So essentially, where the fixed stars are relative to the equinoxes, which is the Sun-Earth relationship, when day and night are completely equal. So that's the relationship between the sun and Earth. So that's like a point. That's where the tropical zodiac is said to begin. Now, if you base the zodiac on the fixed stars, they're anchored to the fixed stars, which slowly drift because of the Earth's axis very slowly wobbling or moving, rotating to change this backdrop of fixed stars. Change. Does that make sense?
So you're saying that the zodiac it's based on the relationships between the Earth and the Sun, and that particularly in relation with the fixed stars, and that we've observed that over. I mean, I understand from my understanding. I understand the wobble, like, and I understand the precession of the equinoxes, at least physically. But when it comes to, I guess when it gets to another layer of like, okay, well, we can, I guess I get confused about is when we can say, oh, these planets are in these constellations, and how does that relate to the great ages that Earth is in? Like
Right.
how can we calculate those very specifically, but we can't calculate our own very specifically? Like, why is there such a varying, like, why is there not a clear, this is when we enter this age?
It's like a whole thing, because there are different ways to measure
Right.
that apparently. And why isn't there one? Infinite are the arguments of mages. I hope there's an Earthsea person in the chat, which is probably not. That's a book reference. Anyways, it's basically just a bunch of disagreement about how far adrift the constellations are from the tropical zodiac. I can't even tell you all the specific different ways people are calculating this.
Right.
I can just tell you that there are multiple different ones. And it's just, so part of it is like where you would consider the sidereal zodiac to even begin. Because the zodiac signs and constellations aren't the same thing. They never have been the same thing. They were more aligned than they are right now 2,000 years ago due to the precession, but they were never the same thing. So the tropical zodiac is based on that sun-earth relationship. The start of the zodiac, 0 degrees of the sign Aries, is on that vernal equinox when day and night are the same amount of time, same length.
What's a vernal equinox?
Vernal is spring.
Okay.
So, and then there would be the fall equinox,
Sure.
the autumnal equinox. But yeah, the spring equinox.
Vernal.
Huh?
That's a nice, I'm going to use that. Vernal, the vernal equinox. It's like Uncle
Vernal.
Vernon. Uncle Vernon.
I know, it sounds like a name. Anyway, so that's what the tropical zodiac, that's what it's based on. The sidereal zodiac is based on the fixed stars. The 0 degrees Aries like starts from the point exactly opposite the fixed star Spica. And there is like variation on where exactly the sidereal zodiac should begin. And since there is like not total agreement there,
Okay.
the fact that like how much they're off from one another varies too. I can also recommend a podcast that goes over all of this.
Sure.
I've listened to it. It's been a long time, and it's not facts that I retained for repeating. My brain selectively remembers like verbatim facts. But yeah, there are just different ways to measure it, different ways to determine how far off it is. And, you know, the great ages are a thing for sure. Like, I'm not going to be like, oh, the yugas are dumb, they don't make any sense. But it's like it's a totally different scale than like the scale or scope you would look at with astrology. So it's one of those things where it's like, I kind of defer to people who have more study around that as far as like what it means for us. Because it's like, people throw around the term Age of Aquarius all the time to mean just a lot of random shit. And most of the time, I don't hear it being used intelligently unless people are a lot more educated on it. So,
yeah. I just had heard about that and about that if there's a time, that there are these great ages and we have the constellations and that we're in it and the precession of the equinoxes. So from what I'm understanding, what you're saying is that there's all this discrepancy because it's more about the system, like this, or the astrological system, all the rules that you're using, like what you're orienting yourself to, what you're calculating things based off of, and all these sort of things. Because there's like solar and lunar and all these, like there's probably, that's what I remember reading something about, like how many different types of calculations you can make, or how many different types of charts you can make based on different systems of astrology, or like different and so there seems to be such a wide varying degree of that. And so when you say that your stuff is based in Hellenistic, is that have anything to do with because you mentioned tropical? Where do those come from? Like, where does tropical come from?
Tropical. So the use of the tropical zodiac um, as like a base measurement system for astrology is a Western thing. So there's Western astrology, and then the most commonly known counterpart would be Vedic astrology or like Indian
Right.
astrology, which uses the sidereal zodiac. There are other kinds of
Sidereal.
like astrologies and things that I'm not studied in at all, like Chinese astrology and like the four pillars and that kind of stuff that I'm not very familiar with. But it seems to be kind of like a Western tradition used the tropical zodiac. Eastern traditions used the sidereal zodiac. And
Sure.
you can see the two lineages kind of interacting around that time where I'm mentioning like these source texts and things. Like you can see a little bit of like information dissemination and like kind of where they came together. You can see a lot of similarities in the techniques too when you look at the two, Vedic astrology and Hellenistic astrology from that time. So yeah, I use the tropical zodiac. Anything you Google around and look for, it's probably going to be based on the tropical zodiac,
Yeah.
unless it literally says sidereal astrology or Vedic astrology. It's
Or
pretty much
or it's in some
guaranteed.
Indian language. It might not be
Right.
tropical.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Okay. Yeah. That I know that's all. There's a lot in there, right? And and I guess I was trying to, because the first time I read about the Great Age was when I was reading Plato, the Timaeus dialogue or whatever, where he kind of describes the origin of the universe in these like mathematical, like algorithmic sequence of like, okay, this happened and this and two became five, and then five messed around with another five, and then they became 30, and then all, and then the big, and there's this whole describing of everything, and then that's where I bought the book, because I think it must have comes from somewhere with spirit science, I'm sure, because the spirit science videos were based on this Drunvalo Melchizedek guy who wrote this sacred thing of the flower of life. The sacred. It was all
Yeah.
about sacred geometry, which I'm down
Yes.
with. But the second book that he made, it started to veer off into some things that I got both the books, and it was interesting, like, to talk about, you should be drawing these things and you should be doing these things, and with psychedelic experiences and with mathematical experiences. And I've seen those cymatic. I don't know if you've seen the cymatic, like a bunch of grains of sand on a plate with a different frequency, and you get to see the different geometric patterns that can be formed, through those vibration. It's like, oh, like, you can interpret reality in these geometric ways. Like, these are how things go. And I'm sure, I don't know, that opened my world to a lot of that stuff. And that was right around 2012 area. And I just remember one time, like right before the December 21st or whatever, the whole thing, which was interesting because I remember going to Mexico with my like girlfriend at the time. We went to some time share in a time chair. No, that sounds like, that's a nice thing. I got a time chair,
Went to a
right?
time fair, as you do
As you
on
do in
vacay.
Mexico, you go to a time chair. But there was a Mayan guy who was the tour guide, and he brought up this great point about how calendars are cyclical, and how it's so silly that people are saying this is the end of the world when it's just the end of a calendar, and about how it's that he's talking about maternal, no, not maternal, femininity is like going to be more like ruled in this next age. And going back to what I was saying, the first time I talk about ages, because I've heard the great age, and I've heard these ages and this stuff, like people are talking about these terms in all different areas of that I've read, different concepts of age and stuff, or epochs, and all these different ways of describing these long periods of times. And I always will get confused, and just like all these different systems of measurement and all this stuff. I could imagine that it must be, you kind of have to operate out of a standard. Okay, let's just use tropical, or
Right. Yeah, and to be honest, like that's kind of how I feel when I hear all those things too. Like And I hate to say that, but like there is
confused.
you reach like a limit when you
Yeah.
start like going down like the spirit science rabbit hole. And what's interesting is like my my husband found it, I'm pretty sure, and then we both like watched a bunch of it together, and like he went the like Zachariah Sitchin route and like
Hmm.
started getting super into like all of that kind of stuff. I went like the astrology palmistry
Hmm.
kind of route. So he started and then he started reading a bunch of like theosophical stuff
Hmm.
and all that stuff. So it's like he asks me about the great ages and stuff too, and he's like, well, like what does that mean, and like how does it interact with like what you do? And it just feels like such a different scope and such a different
Right.
thing that even though they're both connected because it has to do with like the cosmos and like the stars and how that translates cyclically down to cycles here on earth, because that's the whole point, right?
Right.
The celestial movements correlating with earthly events or cycles or happenings. So they're related in that way, but that's kind of where that like
Right.
relation ends as far as what I do with astrology on the level that I do it with. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So I guess then to clarify that with my own mind is that
Mm-hmm.
this the practice that you take in maybe is maybe more is more common in astrology, or is a more useful application is shorter periods, maybe like I don't know, hundreds of years or days. Is that more what you
Yeah.
work in day by day as opposed to or hour by hour? Because you were talking about how the importance of the hour being correct, and that some transits are changed by the hour and things. So,
Yeah.
so that's what you're saying. So, like, once you start getting past thousands of years, then it's hard to make sense of anything. Maybe
Yeah.
with that
Well,
system that you use.
right. Well, and I think part of the reason too is like there are two different ways to look at it. So you can look at really big cycles and how they affect Earth, but when you look at these really big, like thousands of year, long cycles or hundreds of years even, you're not even looking at a human, like many human
Right.
lifetimes happen in that period of time. And what I'm really interested in, the way I use astrology and use the whole concept of celestial movements correlating with earthly happenings is on an individual level. Like I want to be able to sit down with someone and say, at the exact moment you were born, here's what essentially the universe was reflecting, and here's what it means about you. Because I'm really interested in people. That's why I like
Okay.
doing stuff like this or working one on one with clients. Like, how do we take the universal or the cosmological and find your story in it and what resonance that puts you on and what that means about you? You can use astrology, even the same principles that I use with clients. You can use that to look at larger trends, like looking back in history, like what Rick Tarnas does in Cosmos and Psyche, and look at these big cycles. Like Saturn and Pluto were aligned in January, but soon they're going to be configured by a 90 not soon, like in years they'll be configured by a 90-degree separation, an aspect. That's what that's called. Then they'll be in an opposition aspect, 180 degrees. Then they'll be at that square aspect again from different places, and then they'll conjoin again. That's a really long cycle. You can look at that and apply it to societies and cultures and countries and see the stories and see the symbolism. But that would be more of what you could call mundane or world astrology. You can use these principles at that level, but I am the way I choose to go about it and the scale that I use it on is really on an individual level.
Gotcha.
So like it can't, like, you absolutely can zoom out that far. As far as like what time span matters, I'm looking at the time span of like a human lifetime.
Okay.
And a lot of times, sort of to loop back to a question you asked me earlier, people will come to me wanting to know about themselves so they can align with their potential or whatever. But a lot of times that they want to know like what's coming up in the next year. So
Right.
I'll look at a year and say, what's being kind of activated, what themes are going to come to the forefront, what can we take from, who you are and how you were kind of put together when you were born, and what part of that's going to come through and be triggered and be activated and be emphasized in about a year's worth of time. So that's kind of the scale that I use it
Okay.
on.
Yeah, that's good to know, because that's something that's been with this great age and reading it and talking about it, and then knowing we're talking about, you know, these astronomical, you know, it's literally astronomical. It's huge. It's like it's from the beginning of the universe. So it's good to put some constraint on it and make some sense of it all. All right.
Yeah, because it's like, okay, what yuga are we in? The one where we're all believing this like false duality and we're not actually separate and it like sucks for human beings? Great, good to know. I'm gonna wake up tomorrow morning and still be a human. What should I do? Like that's what I always feel like. So it's like, what information, what like actionable or practical or meaningful information or wisdom can I get from the symbolism I'm accessing? And with a smaller scale application of astrology, I personally get more out of it than looking at like a great age.
Yeah.
Like the age of Aquarius, it's like might mean something for our entire society for hundreds of years. But like, again, I'm going to wake up and be kind of in my life and my circumstances. Right. And what then? What does it mean then? So different strokes for different folks.
Yeah. Different scale.
Yeah.
So, okay, we got a couple questions here in the chat I should get to. Just here's the one. Smoky Water Studio and YouTube says, "Hello, Joe. Thanks for being here. Why does Pisces like Taurus so much?"
So so this is kind of the whole idea that like different signs of the zodiac are more or less compatible with one another in various ways.
Yeah, I've heard that. Compatibility tests. The pattern app on my phone telling me if I'm compatible. You can check.
I'm not on the pattern. I've heard so many things about the pattern. I just can't bring myself.
It took them a while to change their things to COVID though, because they'd be like, go outside and do this.
Oh my God,
like,
I know. I know.
We can't go outside. But now they've updated. Now it's like today is a challenge, and this more often now. So, but
yeah, exactly.
That's the one thing I wanted to know about the pattern before you answer the question. I want to know the movements. Like they'll tell you, oh, you're in a cycle. This personality trait is in a cycle. But I want to like click on it and like be like, okay, what does that mean? Like, show me the archetypal source of this. Like, why is my that would be dope. If there was an app that could do that and kind of bridge that, or at least like bridge the story with the thing, but being a little more transparent, I think it would be much more accessible to people. But yeah.
Well, that's what so many astrologers think too. Like CoStar, and I've never interacted with the pattern, so I don't really know what the interface is like. But a lot of these apps will just give you an interpretation or a delineation, and they won't say why. So it just encourages kind of like a blind faith, which is like, look, you can take a lot of comfort even in kind of like knowing that it's just this way because the cosmos said so. Like you can still access things like faith or belief or resonance while still using critical thinking. Like those two things aren't mutually exclusive. So I'm not sure if there is an app that really offers that at this point, because that would be a lot of work. I think the Sanctuary app is better. I know astrologers who write for Sanctuary and who are on their team of like people you can book with. I just don't know much about the app interface because I'm always just doing the astrology myself.
Sure.
And apps exhaust me. But yeah,
don't use the app. Hire an astrologer.
It's literally like, hashtag delete CoStar. Like just delete CoStar. Talk to a human. Like I will tell you these things. Like I will tell you where like what archetypes are interacting and why that means you're in a phase of personal upheaval and transformation and blah, 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 7-year cycle. Like I will tell you like why that is the case and I'll explain what's behind it. But yes, most apps don't tell you that.
Yeah. So sorry to derail that a little bit, but I feel like it makes some context as to like the relationship aspects of things. Why does someone like this? And apps say that and it'll do that. But so why does Pisces like Taurus?
So the reason Pisces likes Taurus is, so there are a couple reasons. So when you look at the zodiac, it's a circle. There are different geometrical relationships between the signs. There are, for example, Taurus and Pisces are 60 degrees apart. There's Pisces and then Aries and then Taurus. So there's a sign in between, and those signs are configured by that 60-degree angle. The nature of these different angles, like 60-degree angle versus a 90-degree angle, they have different qualities. They have different resonances. A 60-degree angle is called a sextile, and it's generally regarded as like a friendly or cooperative relationship. So it means that those two zodiac signs have something in common. Now, the configurations, the aspects between these signs point out commonalities. One of the commonalities that is pointed out by the sextile relationship is that both those signs, Pisces and Taurus, and any signs that are in a sextile configuration or relationship, they are both of the yin quality versus the yang quality. There are 6 yang signs, which are the fire and air signs, and there are 6 yin signs, the earth and water signs. Having that common ground, that same qualitative ground, gives them something in common. Mm-hmm. People like yin is more chill. It's more introspective, more reflective. That's the reason why like Taurus and Pisces just have more similarity and more affinity than like Pisces and Aries. Like Aries is a fire sign. It's like, fuck yeah, dude. Like, let's go do it. Let's go get some shit done. And Pisces is like, I would love to chill and talk about the universe instead. And there's something about that more laid back, more introspective yin energy, receptive energy that gives some common ground. Another reason is because those two signs, their planetary rulers also have similar, they also have common ground. Pisces is ruled by the planet Jupiter. Taurus is ruled by the planet Venus. Those are the 2 benevolent planets. They both have the common interest to generally bestow gifts and blessings and help human beings, essentially. So there's a lot of common ground between these 2 signs. That just increases like compatibility and the just ability to get along and kind of understand one another, be on the same page. So it's because of how they're configured to each other in the zodiac. Essentially, gotcha. That's a technical reason.
That makes sense. So, but just to clarify, the 60 degrees and the way that they're positioned in the cycle is that determined by the actual movements, or is there like what determines the order in that? Is just that's the precession of the equinoxes in order, or is that like, because where does that 60 degrees come from? I guess like it's placed in there geometrically, but is that 60 degrees is just because it's in a circle, right? But yeah. What determines the order of that?
The order of the zodiac signs, like why they're in a certain order, is like a huge question. I don't know if there is an answer for it, but the order is static. Like where the zodiac signs are in the zodiac is completely static and never changes. It does follow an order as far as like the qualities of the zodiac signs. Like you don't have 2 earth signs next to one another. You don't have 2 water signs like in a 90-degree aspect to one another. It seems that it was created that way, or laid out that way with purpose. I don't know where that came from.
Yeah, because I think the only thing I can think of, like whenever I see stuff like the zodiac or the 6 cycles like that, I always think of in music the circle of fifths, which is like the relationships between all the different, all the different keys. And those are all determined by, why are they determined? Like, okay, well, you got to go down and deep. Okay, the overtone series and these relationships between these things, and someone just decided to put it out in this map. And these calculations you can make are really just kind of, they're kind of a domain that we've interpreted based on reality, that we can kind of have these little shortcuts to that we can use using this geometrical representation, and have these little shortcuts where we can find these relationships so easily using just some simple math, as opposed to qualifying out everything and trying to find who knows what, like make sense of it all. But if we have some real representation, we can you can make something out of that. Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Dilla himself on YouTube says, what do you think about biorhythm? What do you think about biorhythm? Do you think about it?
What is that?
This is biorhythm is, I don't know, maybe
I don't know if I've ever, I mean, I feel like it's like I've definitely heard
or biorhythm.
That as a word, but I don't know what that is. I'm not familiar with that as a concept. I can't really speak.
Stella, if you're Stella here, please elaborate. Not an astrologer on Twitch says, what are you talking about with her? Okay, you could listen and you could find out. Creative Rat in Germany asks on Twitch, what do you say to Rudolf Steiner? Do you know who Rudolf Steiner is?
I'm familiar with the name, but like I couldn't
I don't
really
know who
speak to.
Okay, well, those are the questions.
Wah wah.
I posted in there, like, ask a question. If anyone's still listening now, you want to ask a question, just ask a question about something if you're interested. These things are kind of like a soft Q&A thing. Like sometimes people ask questions, sometimes they don't. I don't make it a particular like, okay, here's the Q&A section of things. It's not a formal Q&A thing. It's just kind of sometimes people ask interesting questions. Sometimes they don't.
Yeah, my want was more towards like, I don't know what biorhythm is, and I can't talk about Rudolf Steiner. So
same, not gonna lie. I've heard Rudolf Steiner. Sorry, Creative Rat. I don't know who that is either. And he's the one who sent the correct Corpus Hermeticum. Maybe did you send that to me? Did you send that to me? I looked. I got it with my new computer, and I looked on my, because it's on Amazon. It was on my wish list, and I looked in my ordered history, and it's nowhere to be found. It's nowhere in my order history. So I was like, "This is weird." Like, it was obviously on it was at one point, and I can look, and there was a time when it was removed from my wish list, but I don't see any record of it ever being bought. So I don't know. It could be a glitch or something, or I don't know. Maybe I got to read the thing. Maybe I should read it. But
it's like appropriately mysterious for it being literally the Corpus Hermeticum.
Yeah, because
I love that.
That's like that. From what got me into that, or what got me interested in that, was Hermeticism, which is very, there's a lot of like theosophy and stuff is very much along the same type of line of thinking. It's just more mystical, and I'm not really that. I couldn't tell you a good definition of all these things without looking it up. I'm just learning this stuff, kind of diving into it a little more. But from what I gathered of it was when I was discovering the concept of alchemy in its application, in its history. Like I'd grown up, and I remember my little brother was reading alchemy, like Alchemy for Dummies. I think he literally got Alchemy for Dummies. and he was reading, he's 4 or 5 years younger than me. I should know that. He's 4 years younger than me. And he had it, and I just remember he was like he hadn't gone to college yet, or he's still in high school, and he was still kind of very much like it didn't seem like he had a sensible, or like, or he didn't have enough like grounding of like, okay, how do I get through these, like a more practical plan of like what's going on. And so I was like, don't read alchemy books. Like, this isn't what's gonna give you your, like, it's not gonna give you the structure that you need. This is what I thought in my head at the time, because I was just thinking, oh, alchemy it's old. It's what people did before chemistry, and that's really all I thought about it as a material science. But now that I've been looking, like rereading some other things, and starting to read more Carl Jung, and like understanding Isaac Newton was alchemy, and the history of alchemy, and what it really is, and what the Philosopher's Stone means, and what all these, and I'm sure all this idea matters, because it's all the earth, sun, earth, wind, or no, what is it? The earth, fire, water, and air, right? The four elements, and how those relate to each other, and those are used in astrology, right? For classifications. And someone told me that, like, what's the 52 weeks in a card deck is actually like is astrological thing because it's all like it's based on a calendar. That there's four suits, 52 weeks, and the Joker is the leap year, and like day and the. I was like, whoa, that's crazy with the sweets and the like. It's
there are like so many. There are so many connections between like alchemy and just like the like whole Western occult tradition and astrology. Like there's so much more interwoven than you might originally think. And things like, you know, a deck of cards or whatever. Because like people do like divination, like cartomancy with playing cards.
Yeah.
Like you would do with tarot cards or something.
Cards with her playing cards.
Right. Like there are so many connections there between like all these different things. Like you're saying like the four elements and like all this stuff. And yes. So complicated way to say yes.
I think I still like that. I've had tarot. I've done tarot a few times, and there was a couple times where it was a flop because the person wasn't really well read in what it was, and just totally making like judgments calls and stuff on that you could tell they were just kind of throwing things out there and weren't really it wasn't coming from a more hardened practice of like, okay, these is what these means and this is what this is. Because if you in the tarot, the artwork has so much to do with these images, right? Of the artwork has so much to do with the interpretation too. So you're really using artistic lens too in that to make some of this interpretation. But okay, we got two questions, basically the same question, one on YouTube and one on Facebook. So people are interested. They say, essentially, can you recommend some books with illustrations or just books that you suggest to have a better understanding? Someone who could start to have a better understanding. So someone who might not know as much, or someone said they didn't know what to ask because they don't know anything about astrology. So where do you start if you want to get to know? What would you recommend? You said Cosmos and Psyche, but is that more for practitioners of astrology, or is
not at all? Did you know that book wasn't even like meant? It was like what Rick Tarnas was trying to write, and then he like needed to write an introduction, and that's what Passion of the Western Mind actually is. And then Cosmos and Psyche, the subtitle is like intimations in a new worldview or something. Cosmos and Psyche is a great read for anybody. Okay. It's a really good, like if you want to wrap your head around like how and why would astrology work, it's a great read. However, if you want to learn how to use astrology, I would go a different direction. A beginner's book that I recommend is, I'm looking for it on my bookshelf. It's actually on loan right now. It's called Understanding the Birth Chart. It's a very boring title, but it'll really give you, it's by Kevin Burke. It'll give you a really solid
Kevin Burke
introduction. Mm-hmm.
B-U-R-T.
Introduction. Yeah. B-U-R-K.
Oh, Burke. Got it.
Yeah. Burke. It will give you a solid introduction to like the core principles of astrology and those moving parts that all work together that you begin to combine in order to create actual interpretations or delineations. That's a really good one. Another really good one is Astrology for Yourself by Demetra George. Demetra is a legend. She's incredible.
Astrology that book for is Yourself by Demetra. D-E-M-E-T-R-I.
Just A, no I.
Demetra. That's a cool name. Demetra, what's the surname?
George.
George. Okay, I know that one.
Yep, exactly how it sounds. But it's a good way to kind of start to understand your own natal chart. She's an incredible astrologer. She has this like crazy story of like she went to college and then like went to live on a commune like off the grid with a bunch of hippies and like found astrology books in their library and like taught herself astrology and then like went back to school for classics later because she loves school, and she's become like such an iconic and integral part of the community for all her translation work that she's done, bringing Hellenistic astrology into synthesis with like a modern context.
Is she Greek, or does she speak Greek, or was she said she's translating it, or she just
I'm laughing because I was like, oh, she just knows. It's the gift.
She just knows it,
it's
man.
not. That's not true at all. She learned Greek because there's so much of that stuff when you like get into classics, you kind of have to. But no, she's just from the US. But that's just something.
Is that her given name, Demetra?
Yeah, Demetra is her given name.
Okay, dope.
Like pretty dope, honestly.
Yeah.
I would feel very destined for astrology if my name were Demetra. But anyway, that's a really good one too.
Demeter?
Yeah.
There you go. It's everywhere. Can't stop it.
Everywhere.
Well, we've been chatting for 2.5 hours almost, so I think I could continue to go, I'm sure, but I think it's probably a good spot as any. We got some great recommendations. And if you want to know more, just hit up Joe. We got the, well, we can type your website in there. It's just Joe Gleason, right?
JoeGleason.com. I actually have like a post. I have like a listicle for recommendations for where to start if you want to learn astrology.
Okay.
On my website, my good old blog. So there's a list there. It includes
clients,
those 2 books.
Right? You'd be taking some clients. So anyone who wants to know, you hit her up. I'm sure she'll be more than, I mean, I'm speaking for you right now, but I would imagine that you'd be more than happy to chat about it. So that's great. Clients. Awesome. Yeah. Well, yeah, thanks so much for coming on and it's nice to finally meet you and chat. We should do it again. Go on Twitch.
We should. I know. I have so many questions for you I didn't even get to ask. Like, I feel like, I have so many questions about like your music and stuff like that and like all of that and how that would fit astrologically and stuff. But anyway, and just questions because I think your music's really cool and I would love to chat about that sometime. But thank you so much for having me on. This was fun.
Yeah, well, you say that now when it's over, I'd be like, oh, what do you want to know? What do you I feel like after a while you start 2.5 is a good
it's a good stopping point, but I really do mean it. Like I
appreciate that. Yeah, no, I think thanks for coming on and thanks for listening to the music and we'll have another conversation. I'm actually very interested, like I was saying, this is part of why I wanted to chat with you is my own curiosity about this all, because I feel like I've mentioned this before, but I feel like it's a useful tool for storytelling, at the very least, for myself. And the more, maybe that's just what I've been consumed by is understanding story and stuff. So I see it everywhere, and I see it pervasive in every aspect of life. Is the stories we weave, the masks we wear, all those different things. But thanks again. Yeah,
that's very much like I resonate so much with just that whole concept and worldview. So I feel like we could nerd out a whole bunch on stories and story making and all that stuff. So we'll have to do that another time.
That sounds great. Yeah, let's fuck around more on Twitch. I know that they have some aspects of like, I know Twitch channels can like combine, or you can like host each other.
I'm actually hosting your Twitch channel on my channel.
Oh,
right
you
now.
are? Oh. Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. So
just in case people are like, I don't know where it is, and they went to my channel.
Yeah.
Unlikely. I've done like 2 streams in my life. It's not like I have a Twitch following.
Well,
but
that's probably where the _N_astrologer came from. Maybe came from you.
Yeah.
Maybe so. Got a new follow. So that's you.
Love it.
That's on you, man. All right. Well, thanks, Joe. Yeah, absolutely. Let's do this again. Let's keep in touch.
Yeah, for sure. Have a good rest of your day.
Will do. You as well. Bye-bye now. All right, I'm going to...